Next panel. As I mentioned earlier, and as many of you have already enjoyed, we have this wonderful exhibit of President Bush's portraits of world leaders that was provided to us courtesy of the George W. Bush Presidential Center. It's on display until 6 p.m. today, so be sure you have a chance to get down to the other side of the Grand to Spring Creek 1 and see that amazing exhibit. But we have right now, to tell us a little bit more about the exhibit, she actually brought these paintings to us, but I'm very pleased to introduce to you Rachael Mabry, who is the Regional Director of the George W. Bush Presidential Center in Dallas.
Well, thank you all very much for the introduction, Jennifer, and for having me. President Bush was delighted to be able to share a select group of his paintings with you all, with just a fine group, and I hope you've had a chance to see them. Like Jennifer said, they'll be on display till 6. And a special thanks goes to Ron and Chinzaleza for having this fabulous idea of including us in this wonderful event. Yes. As I mentioned, the portraits are from a larger collection called The Art of Leadership, a President's Personal Diplomacy. President Bush completed the collection in 2014, and they were originally on display at the George W. Bush Presidential Center in Dallas. They traveled a little bit after that and then went into retirement in our archives, and we pulled them out of retirement just for this event, so we're pleased to be able to do it. The exhibit focused on how developing personal relationships with other world leaders can enable a president to influence world affairs. In addition to a rotating exhibit space at the Bush Center has the presidential records, the main exhibit, which takes visitors through key decisions of the Bush administration, and the Bush Institute. We are the 13th presidential library in the National Archives and Records Administration. The presidential library system founded by FDR plays a quiet but crucial role for our country. Previously, presidents actually kept their own records. So now it's a little bit more streamlined in that we have a place where scholars can actually go and research the presidents and their records, and makes history accessible to all Americans. These libraries help us interpret our shared American story, a story of expansion of human freedom, of the triumph of human will, and the pivotal decisions that are made. For example, our museum houses steel columns from the World Trade Center, artifacts from a moment in history when terrorist attacks demolished tall buildings but could not dent the steel of American resolve. The museum also houses a lifetime replica of the Oval Office, a room that reminds you that the presidency is much larger than just one person and carries with it a responsibility to lead to a brighter tomorrow. We hold public events that showcase thought-provoking leaders in research, and our recent events have included speakers such as Paul Ryan, Lynn Cheney, and Dr. Henry Kissinger. We've also featured Hank Paulson, Michael Bloomberg, and Charles Krauthammer as well. These events underscore the policy work that we do through the Bush Institute. Serving as the policy arm of the center, the Institute builds on the work of President and Mrs. Bush by launching programs that are uniquely suited to our resources and meeting needs that others are not. The work focuses on developing leaders, fostering important policy, and taking action to save and change lives around the world. All of the work ties back to these three goals. Whether we're supporting our nation's military servicemen and women, creating curriculum for a leadership program, or meeting with policymakers to discuss new research, it all goes back to those three purposes. For example, our military service initiative works to ensure post-9/11 veterans and their families make successful transitions from military service to civilian life, with a focus on gaining meaningful employment and overcoming invisible wounds of war. As you probably know, this is a big passion of President Bush's, and over the years, he has interacted with countless servicemen and women. In fact, our latest exhibit, entitled Portraits of Courage, a Commander-in-Chief's Tribute to the American Warriors, brings together 66 full-color portraits that he's done of these veterans, and 4-panel mural painted by President Bush that honor the sacrifice and courage of our men and women in uniform since 9/11. The exhibit seeks to examine the invisible wounds that veterans experience and again, their transition from military service to civilian life. The paintings are on display in Dallas through October at the Bush Center, and we also released a book that I know is for sale at your book table. President Bush released this book honoring those men and women in his paintings, and all the proceeds of the book go to support the Military Service Initiative at the Bush Center. And I want to save a little bit of time so y'all can hear from the man himself why he started painting in the first place. So without further ado, if you'll cue the video.
Well, like this afternoon, I'll be up here about 2:30, and we'll paint till about 6. Sometimes crank up some music, and I just let her go.
That's the really wonderful thing about painting, is that it's absolutely transporting.
2 years ago, I was sitting up here wondering how to kind of live life to the fullest. And I read Winston Churchill's essay, Painting as a Pastime, and it inspired me. I had never lifted a brush before, I'd never mixed a paint, so I gave it a whirl. I spent a lot of time on personal diplomacy, and I befriended leaders. I learned about their families and their likes and dislikes, to the point where I felt comfortable painting them.
I watched President George W. Bush really try to get to know the person across the table or sitting next to him in the Oval Office. I saw even the most difficult leaders then begin to talk about what mattered to them in a very deeply personal sense. And having then broken the ice, you can go on to the more difficult questions.
I watched one of the best at personal diplomacy in my dad. He was amazing about befriending people where there may not be common interests. And I emulated that. Our ranch is very special to Laura and me. And one way to have conducted personal diplomacy was to include leaders into this very special place.
One of the great things about personal diplomacy is inviting people to your own home. And people love to come to our ranch.
Crown Prince Abdullah had come to the ranch. Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. There was a difficult moment taking place in the Middle East, and we had a slight difference of opinion about how the situation ought to be handled. And he was threatening to leave, and so before he left, I said, why don't you take a ride with me on the ranch? I knew he loved the land. He's got a farm that's very special to him. And he and I became close. We have a fairly significant age difference, but nevertheless, it was the beginning of a trusting relationship. And I grew to be very fond of the Crown Prince, soon to be king. Painting portraits of my friends and some people who weren't necessarily my friends gave me a sense to convey a feeling I have about them, because I got to know them well during the presidency. What people will be able to come away with is, how do I feel about somebody I painted? Darn good. Go, Ron. Tony Blair, for example. I must have met with him over 25 times. I mean, we became good friends. I painted a portrait of Tony with a lot of affection. I wanted people to say, he's a man of conviction. I like him a lot. I liked him when I was president. I like him when I was painting him. The Dalai Lama is a friend of Laura and mine. He captured our hearts because he's a very sweet man, and I painted him as sweetly as I could. I met with him quite frequently, and we became friends. I got to know Maliki well, intentionally, because he was the leader of a new democracy. And, of course, we wanted that democracy to succeed. I spent a lot of time talking to Prime Minister Maliki, listening to his concerns. Because I believe in you.
We were in Iraq, and we had gathered the tribes that would be the Anbar Awakening, the sheikhs.
Mr. Prime Minister, thank you.
You could see President Bush being able to bring them together,
Mr. President, thank you.
asking them, well, tell me about your family. Tell me about your family. And just breaking the ice to the point that they actually could start to talk to each other. It was really a quite remarkable moment.
During my presidency, there was a pandemic that was destroying an entire generation of Africans, and I decided that the United States should do something about it. And so I had a chance to work with a lot of African leaders, some of whom I painted.
When Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was elected the first woman president of Liberia, I got to go, and Barbara came with me, my daughter, and Dr. Condoleezza Rice, to represent the United States at the inauguration of the first woman president in a country in Africa.
They reported back, you're going to like this woman. She is strong, she's capable, and they were right. I traveled to Liberia, visited with Ellen. She has got a strong determination to succeed. And so I painted her as a strong woman leader, and she is. I called Koizumi to thank him for his leadership of Japan during my presidency, and he said he's going to come to the States. And I said, well, what would you like to do? And he said, I want to go to Graceland. I knew he loved Elvis. I didn't realize how much he loved Elvis. It was a hoot. It was really fun. To me, that was a sign of successful personal diplomacy.
Wise men say,
We need karaoke
rushing.
I thought you were going to do blue suede shoes. I see things differently, and I'm still learning.
I think really what George is teaching everybody is that it's never too late to start something new.
Yeah, you can teach an old dog new tricks. I expect I'll be painting till I drop, and my last stroke, and I'll be heading into the grave, and I wonder what color it'll be. Anyway, it's been a joyful experience. I fully understand that the signature is worth more than the painting.
Thank you again for having us. So delighted to be able to share these paintings with you all. And again, they're on display till 6.